Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Audrey Russo, President and CEO of the Pittsburgh Technology Council. I know we're headed into a long weekend for many over Labor Day, but I am pretty thrilled to have today's guest on. We are recording the show so we can make it available for others as we start to wind down our week. So we are joined here by Gregg Behr, but in a minute, I am going to introduce him more formally. But what I'd like to do is just give a shout out to our sponsors, Huntington Bank and Sheets. And Huntington Bank has been with us right from the beginning, meaning they've been very involved in all issues related to small businesses in the pandemic. And Sheets actually has an innovation center in Pittsburgh, and their work is to transform Sheets yet once again. They do a lot of things in terms of innovation. So just want to extend appreciation to them. And tomorrow we're actually taking Friday off and Monday as well. We've been at this for 22 or 23 weeks. And I think my team needs a break. And in honor of school starting and all the things related to kids, it couldn't be a better time for us to have Gregg join us. So we like to say this is, next Tuesday. I do want to give a highlight about next Tuesday. We have the Highmark Health team talking about the tips on staying safe. And that includes Dr. Susan Manzi, she's a physician chairperson at AHN, and Jeff Bernhardt, he's an SVP at Highmark Health. We've been working with them on making sure that information around staying safe is accessible and prevalent. So, and then we're also going to hear from Google and Bridgeway Capital to talk about how they're teaming up to help small businesses as well, and many more great programs ahead. So I also need to give a shout out to Comcast. They have been with us right from the onset, and they've been helping really make sure that people have access to Wi-Fi and hope to eradicate the digital divide, which has really been forefront in the issues that we've been hearing about and trying to support. So I want to jump in and, I'm thrilled. I've known Gregg for, I guess, over a decade. He has been around in our community leading some amazing things and thinking in terms of kids, and as well as his leadership role, at the Grable Foundation. But, you've been there almost 14 years, headed into your 15th year with, I think it's like a few months away. And I want to bring Gregg on. You started your career as an attorney, if I have this correctly. Got a law degree. You also have a degree in public policy. Just tell us, first of all, welcome, and then tell us a little bit about Gregg, the man, the professional, the guy who's been just really heralding a lot around kids in our community and making this a place where goodness and kids are really at the forefront.
Thank you, Audrey. It's an honor to be here. And yes, I am a Pittsburgh kid. I grew up in this region. I moved back here 20 years ago, and I was fortunate to begin my career at Buchanan, Ingersoll, and Bruni in the litigation section, and was supported remarkably by our then department chair, Tom Van Kirk, and subsequently our CEO. And he created an environment for us to practice law in a great way, but also to be engaged in the community. And in the course of some of that work, came to represent some of the tax-exempt organizations and charitable organizations in our community. And not long into my career as an attorney, moved to the Forbes Funds at the Pittsburgh Foundation, where I was for nearly 5 years. And the Forbes Funds, as I think you know, focuses on the region's nonprofit sector and how the sector's organizations do their work and do it better, and invest in capacity building, investing in leadership, investing in research, so that we smartly move ahead together as a civil society. And it was in late 2006 that I was invited to join the Grable Foundation, where I have been for nearly 15 years now, and work for some of the best people on planet Earth. And they are dedicated to improving the lives of children and youth in this region. And then the caring adults in their lives, the educators, the parents, the families, and caregivers. And so my blessing is that I get to wake up every morning thinking about how do we make this little corner of the world one of the best places to be a kid, to be a young person, but also made easier to raise children. And And that's our work.
So, but then there's Remake Learning. How does Remake Learning, because that's something that people probably need to understand about how you've actually spearheaded that as well. So how does that dovetail, and talk about what Remake Learning is?
So I have the privilege of being co-chair for Remake Learning. I share that position with Dean Valerie Kinlock of the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh and Dr. Jim DeNova from the Benedum Foundation. As we sit here in 2020, Remake Learning is a regional learning network involving thousands of educators, technologists, artists, designers, representing more than 500 schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, after-school programs, and the like, all collectively thinking about what is relevant, what is engaging, and what is equitable as we think about young people and their futures as they navigate societal and technological change. This work, though, began really simply, and some folks will know it originally as Kids and Creativity. It started in 2007, and it was really the result of community conversations and understanding that not only among educators, but also among technologists and designers and artists, people started noticing something different about young people. And I began to hear teachers and youth workers and librarians say, you know, I'm not connecting with my class the way that I used to, right? And at first I just chalked it up, Audrey, as like, oh, kids these days, right? But as I began to listen, I really appreciated that they meant my classroom in 2005 versus 2006. And then I started hearing something similar as we were meeting with gamers and others that were also working in the education space, trying to improve the lives of kids. And it feels naive to say it now, but back in that time period, I quite frankly wasn't aware of the entire field of learning sciences, what we were learning about learning itself, and in fact that something seismic was happening in kids' lives, that they were developing their identities differently, seeking affirmation differently, consuming and producing information differently. And so we as a community began to make a bet then to say, you know, in fact, if kids are different and their futures are fundamentally different than the futures we've inherited and for which we were prepared, how do we think differently about instructional practices in schools? How do we think differently about the design of spaces, whether that's in a library or a museum exhibit? How do we think differently about preparing the adults in kids' lives to support our young learners in different ways? And so Pittsburgh has really gained both national and international attention over these past 15 years because of our collective work to wrestle with this future of learning and the future of justice learning in this context.
You've had a lot of partnerships too over the years. Talk about that. I totally forgot it was called Kids and Creativity, but talk about the partnerships that you've established, because I think that has been a tremendous asset in terms of the way that you've penetrated across schools and communities. And, you know, I'm not going to put any words in your mouth because I know you've done a lot.
Yeah, well, we have all heard that phrase, it takes a village. Well, it really does take a village to raise a child, and especially in this environment. And so mindful that kids, yes, they spend important hours in a school building. They're only spending 14 to 20% of their waking hours in the brick and mortar school building itself. And so there are all sorts of other places where young people are learning. The library, the after school program, the early learning center, at home, online. And so the question before us was, how do we start to weave this together? And how do we start to forge partnerships among school districts and the Carnegie Science Center and the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh, or Carnegie Mellon University, as well as what's world-class. Sometimes world-class is right down the street in Oakland for us, right, or in another part of the region. And it's a matter of forging those relationships so that maybe a first grade teacher is working with a technologist in the new way, or a maker is working with the design exhibitor at the Children's Museum. But sometimes world-class is across the country in California at an organization like Common Sense, or in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian Institute, or up at Harvard at Agency by Design. And so we worked too to start building those bridges between world-class work happening elsewhere as people were wrestling with the same sorts of things, and how do we make that work relevant in Pittsburgh? And that's actually grown to be international too, working with organizations like 100 in Helsinki or Big Change out of London, There are great ideas all around the world, and we try and be selfish in a really positive, constructive way of bringing those great ideas, those great people, those great projects to benefit the lives and learning of young people in our region.
And so if you go to Remake Learning, everyone, I'll put the link out there, but if you go to Remake Learning, there's a lot of resources out there. And I think that's a great place for a place of home to know what's happening here in the region. Are there any other, if there are any other resources, Greg, let us know, and we want to be able to share that with our community.
Yeah, so let me share three. So you've shared Remake Learning, and Remake Learning itself is, it's a network, it's a cluster, it's an ecosystem, most certainly designed for educators and their allies, like those technologists and artists and gamers and others who are in the informal learning space. That bridge between out of school time and early learning and formal education has become so porous in our region over the past 20 years. But there's also the parent, family, caregiver facing side of it. So 4 years ago, Remake Learning launched something called Remake Learning Days. So we thought, could we take the idea of a school open house, something with which we're all familiar, and apply it to a region in a festival-like way, so that parents, families, and caregivers could get into maker spaces and technology-enhanced learning labs and STEM labs and other places where new ways of learning were taking shape. And as an adult, most of us probably didn't have these experiences, or we maybe had similar experiences, but they're thought of in new ways, right? So if your kid is lit up by coding, or your kid is lit up by makey or maker-centered learning, how do you support him or her? And so the idea behind Remake Learning Days was, let's have a whole series of family-friendly events all across our region, thinking of our region as a learning campus. And that first event, Audrey, in 2016, there were more than 250 events in schools, museums, libraries, out-of-school time programs that attracted more than 25,000 families. That event has been held every year since, except this year. And it's taken root in other cities. So last year, 8 other cities across America hosted their version of Remake Learning Days. And in 2021, it'll be held in 16 cities across the United States and regions. So from the state of Oregon and the city of San Diego to Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, and of course, southwestern Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia. The link for that is remakelearningdays.org. And then I'd also point out kidsburg.org. So the Grable Foundation, together with others, has invested in a platform called kidsburg.org, which is really an incredible partnership among KDKA Television, Next Pittsburgh, and then a whole series of youth-serving organizations. The whole idea being to make clear for parents, families, and caregivers the people, the ideas, the projects, the events that they could take advantage of and make, bring into their lives. And so ideally that makes it a little bit easier to be a parent, to find those sorts of things so that they're not gems, but they're obvious to us all across the Pittsburgh region. That's kidsburg.org.
Okay, that's great. We're putting them out there now so people can see it and have access to it. So here we are, almost 6 months into, this pandemic, and it seems like, you've been well prepared for it in many ways. It seems like it's been everything that you've been doing and building and connecting are the actual things that we need today for kids. Do you feel that way, or do you feel like there's like this accelerated kind of angst in terms of what we need to do in terms of kids? Or can you feel both ways?
I feel both ways, Audrey, but I think you're absolutely right. And our region as a region has invested in any number of field building organizations and intermediaries, like Trying Together in the early learning space, the Allegheny Partnership for Out of School Time in the after school space, the Arts Education Collaborative, Allies for Children, the Mentoring Partnership, Remake Learning. I could go on and on. I mention these organizations because, for funders like the Grable Foundation, these are in many ways unsexy investments, right? But it's that year in, year out investment in an infrastructure that supports a whole field of organizations, like the Mentoring Partnership, being in position to support more than 150 discrete mentoring programs in our community. And one of the things as we reflect upon lessons learned in these past 5, 6, 7 months is the absolute importance of that infrastructure and how pivotal that infrastructure has been to supporting individual organizations, communities, being able to think broadly about the systems that we need to have in place to support professional learning differently, to support the development of learning pods as Trying Together and the Department of Human Services and others are now doing. It's just accelerated the potential of this region to think of creative responses to the very real challenges that people and organizations are facing. And it's that infrastructure that is so critical. And I feel really lucky to work for trustees at the Grable Foundation that value that have supported that. And fortunately, that's true of a lot of our funding to community. And it's been really critical during this time.
So one of the questions, Gretchen, who's from VP of Marketing at First Insight, is saying, how do you collaborate with Carnegie Science Center's Stemisphere?
Yes, so, well, first, we're privileged to support the Carnegie Science Center at the Grable Foundation. They do tremendous work with their STEM Excellence Pathways program, to say nothing of their, the space that they occupy and the way that they take the Carnegie Science Center on the road to spaces. Our colleagues at the Carnegie Science Center have been deeply involved in different ways with Remake Learning, with Computer Science for Pittsburgh, CS for PGH, with the STEM Learning Ecosystem. They've been involved in spearheading some incredible STEM blended with maker mentoring programs, particularly supporting Black and Brown youth. And in fact, the Carnegie Science Center is among 17 organizations that we were just privileged to support as they think about the future, right? Because the challenge we face right now is not only obviously responding to the thing that's right in front of us, but also preparing for what will be very different futures. And so, for example, the Carnegie Science Center, in using all of that STEM acumen, is really thinking about virtual field trips and other ways that we make STEM and STEM learning available, which post-pandemic, think about how a place like the Carnegie Science Center or the History Center or the Museum of Art might be differently available to rural learners or learners with different challenges, and how important some of these lessons learned will be not only for right now, but for how we're better going forward.
So are you seeing what are you seeing that surprises you over these last 6 months? Are there anything that surprises you, or you think that there are some examples of really some great success in terms of what we've been working on in terms of the region? Because we've been trying to make sure that people get tools, right? So that the students get tools and they have the tools that they need to be connected, et cetera. And that's just sort of one layer, right? That's just sort of one layer. What are you seeing?
Well, that, in a sense, that was a surprise. I mean, honestly, I didn't fully appreciate, or I didn't exactly understand the entire broadband infrastructure. And and it's been a surprise to me what a patchwork that is, how broken that is,
right? And
how we need to think about that infrastructure the way that we think about bridges and roads. So that's been a personal learning. It's a subject matter. I had a blind spot about it. I wasn't attentive to it enough. I'm not surprised about the deep challenges of poverty. I'm not surprised, but I'm differently attuned to the deep challenges of racism.
Right.
What doesn't surprise me is how amazing educators have been. And when I say educators, I mean, yes, those K-12 teachers and those principals and the superintendents, but also the youth workers and the early childhood educators. Educator understood broadly in and out of school, early childhood through higher education. And what doesn't surprise me is how amazing they've been. We often, and at one point I was guilty of this myself, we just talk about schools as if they've been stuck in some industrial age model. And the reality is there's no profession that has been more attentive to its craft and honing its craft and has been producing Teslas year in, year out than has the education profession. And it is stunning how easily and how quickly they moved rapidly to respond to kids learning in March, April, and over the course of the summer. And we can't have enough thanks and appreciation to teachers and principals and superintendents. They have worked and reworked their plans, if not 57, then 57,000 times over these months, and especially in just these few weeks now as school gets underway. And that doesn't surprise me, but it needs to be called out how awesome it really is.
Yeah, they're definitely unsung heroes. I mean, in terms of the work that they're doing. There are a couple of questions here, and I'm not going to put you on the spot on part of Simmons' statement, but she's talking about just commenting on these reading and math scores that she was reading about last week. And then she makes a comment about the superintendent's contract. I'm not going to ask you to respond to that per se, but I would say, how are we and how are you measuring success? Any comments on that in terms of, or you're just not surprised?
Well, look, we all need to be sober about where we are in terms of educational achievement all across the region, right? Not particular to any one school district. Right. I think we should also be really mindful of what's happening in the class divide, right? I follow the work of Opportunity Insights closely, and this is just one data point about online math instruction. But if you look at that data coming out of Harvard and Brown, and you look at math instruction and persistence and progress, and you just separate the data by high income and low income, we have taken the achievement gap, the opportunity gap, and it's gone like this. It is just widened in a way that higher income students have progressed, say 40 to 45%, where low income have dropped 30 to 35%. Right. That's just one data point. I think we have to be especially mindful about that. But it's also true, Audrey, it was true before, and I think it's incredibly important now as we look ahead to ask ourselves, are we measuring the right things? Are we measuring evidence of learning in the right ways? And there is absolutely a place for testing and progress and achievement, but how do we think about all of these other new ways of learning? How do we think about the important social and emotional learning that's happening in our classrooms and our schools? I'm not saying that everything needs to be measured, but I also think we need to think differently about evidence for learning. And it's why I get so excited as I look at local school districts and the way they start to think about graduate profiles or portfolios or new ways of assessing the comprehensive learning that's happening all around us. And maybe that's another lesson learned too about this time period, right? I had a close colleague describe her own childhood to me, and she said, I began to appreciate that the people around me were books, right? There is wisdom all around us, and there is, and how do we really capture that community sense of learning that young people, how do we make that present and relevant to them and help them build their networks? Because that's more than just math and reading scores, as important as math and reading scores are. I don't want to diminish that. Right.
No, that's really a good point. But we're bound by a lot of federal and state compliance rules. So how
we're bound because we create those as bounds for us.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, good point. So you have a question from Christine Ferguson, who's saying, how do you engage with our state legislators to inform them of the urgent need to invest in education in Pennsylvania? I mean, we've done that at the Tech Council. What about from where you sit?
Yeah, well, the good news is that when I look back at Grable's support and also other funder support for these field building organizations like Allies for Children, Trying Together, the Allegheny Partnership for Out of School Time, also intermediate units like the Allegheny Intermediate Unit or Intermediate Unit 1. They are doing great lobbying and advocacy work. They're creating opportunities for legislators and their staffs and others to get into these learning spaces to see and appreciate what's happening. They're present in Harrisburg. They're developing communications. So we're not directly engaged in lobbying, We have some restrictions, but
Right.
we're privileged to support organizations that are engaged. And that happens at a local level of school boards, and it happens in Harrisburg and in DC as well.
Okay, good. And then Brian there's an organization that he is pretty passionate about. It's called Opportunity Insights. They've expanded their work to Pittsburgh. Do you know anything about that project?
Well, I mentioned Opportunity Insights a moment ago in the sense
Right.
that I track and follow their data. I have to admit, I don't know what they're doing in Pittsburgh, but that excites me.
Good. So that excites us too. So we'll follow up on that as well. And so you have a thank you, Gregg, for all that you do. And why support STEAM versus STEM? That's one question. And then the other is, how do you track your impact on invested projects?
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
So we think it's important to support all new kinds of learning, right? STEM, STEAM, maker, technology enhanced learning, connected learning. In many ways, there are many ways and phrases to describe new ways of learning. And one way to think about it is you and I have individual interests. You might be interested in beekeeping. I'm interested in making wine. Well, the reality is that schools, organizations, museums, they also have interests. Some have a STEM orientation. Some have a STEAM orientation. Some have a maker orientation. And so when we think about remake learning and supporting what is simultaneously timeless and classic, like the caring relationships of adults with young people, but then also think about new ways of learning like STEM and STEAM and maker, right? It's about tapping into those interests of those organizations and not pronouncing that like, now we shall all do STEAM, right? But rather to say, if you're experimenting in your classroom, if you're trying to innovate, if you're trying to do great things on behalf of young people and advance great teaching and learning, use that interest of yours, but then start to bump up against these other approaches, frameworks, and pedagogical approaches. You know, what might STEM learn from project-based learning? What can project-based learning learn from technology-enhanced learning? And that's the beautiful umbrella of remake learning, is that these interests start to bump up against each other. In terms of tracking impact, of course, we follow and track data, whether that's data is coming nationally from Opportunity Insights or if it's coming from the Department of Human Services. But we also try and be realistic about data. And I feel like in the individual grants that a foundation like Grable or others is making, it's always a negotiated decision. Like what stands as proxy, right? Because we're not also investing in the amount of funds to do social scientific, right, statistically relevant data. It wouldn't even be prudent or smart. We've taken an orientation to support the work, but you can be rest assured that we are tracking the data, that we are always curious about what data and research should stand as proxy for the type of results we should all expect because of this investment in, say, early literacy, or this investment in technology enhanced learning, or this investment in STEM. Yes.
Well, I actually appreciate this approach that you have, because there is a messiness to this next iteration of innovation, and taking these kinds of risks and investing in these kinds of experiments allows for access to an array of things that many would not have had access to. So I applaud you for taking that kind of neural pathway to create these relationships across the region, as well as understanding because you long have understood the bifurcation of where we are in our region. You have. This wasn't just because of COVID. So I applaud you for that. I think there's Georgia Berner has saying, I think it's really a statement that you said you're not lobbying, which is obvious. I think she wants to be sure that you're being consulted as an expert by legislators and organizations. So I think there's just an affirmation.
That's true. That's true, right? And look, part of this work is also about creating a mindset for our school boards, for our legislators, for anyone in position of budgeting, public budgeting, the design of programs and the like, about the types of futures that we need to create for our young people, and then their educators, parents, and families and caregivers. And it's often why I turn to the story of Fred Rogers, right? Because Fred Rogers is our local hero. There's a reason, there's a monument honoring Fred Rogers as a memorial to children at the confluence of our rivers. And I think it's important to think about Fred Rogers and that story differently than we might otherwise. Yes, he was a caring, loving person, and he was absolutely grounded in child development theory and practice. But you know what? He was also a remarkable innovator. He was a disruptor. He was an absolute geek. He saw the technology of his day and asked the question, how do I make what's attractive to young people good and constructive?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I think about the thousands of educators and technologists and designers and others in our region who are thinking about devices and practices and spaces, in many ways, they are modern day Fred Rogers. Remake Learning is nothing more than thousands of modern day Fred Rogers who are simultaneously grounded in child development theory and practice and what's good, and also looking to young people's futures and what they want and need.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the time that we're spending, a little window into the world of Gregg. Runs the Grable Foundation and actually does a lot of the magical things that have made the conversations about Pittsburgh being an incredible place to raise a family and to build the future. You've done that. You've done that, and you have left an indelible mark. So I applaud you for that. Where do we get those T-shirts that you're wearing?
This T-shirt came as a gift from my kids for Father's Day. So I'm not quite sure where you get this gift, but I will tell you there's another T-shirt that I wear often that is hashtag Be the Kind Kid.
Right.
And BeTheKindKid.net is a place to find that T-shirt. And
Okay.
I'll tell you, so that was a youth developed project, and those young people have now sold more than 50,000 T-shirts to other school kids all across the region and then across the continent from Nova Scotia to California.
Okay. So
it's a reminder about the amazing potential of our young people themselves.
So we have the link out there, Be the Kind Kid.
.net.
So, Gregg, is there anything that you want to tell the tech community that perhaps we didn't cover during this period of time?
Audrey, I just would want to say thank you, right? I have absolute gratitude for you, for the Tech Council, and the community that you support, the ways in which you have come forward in creative and ingenious ways during this time period as we navigate troubles. And I know that's not new work to you. You've been doing that for a long time. You're going to do it for a long time to come. And I'm just so grateful that that incredible moral consciousness that you bring to the work. So thank you.
Thank you. So you heard it. We had a great time with you today. It is a long weekend ahead. People are giving you lots of applauses on our chat, Gregg. So we are going to stay connected to you. We know that the next 6 months ahead won't look like the last, and we count on you for your leadership for that. So I want to say thank you. Thank you to the Grable Foundation. Thank you for the work you've done at Remake Learning. And I want to tell everyone, have an amazing holiday. We are closing down tomorrow and Monday so that my team can just take a breather. We actually have the Athena Awards next week. In addition to the work that we do, we're trying to make sure that women who have lifted the lives of so many others are being recognized. So we're having a ton of fun. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you back here on Tuesday. And thanks to Gregg Behr for all that he does.
Thank you.